Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. In today's story, we step back thousands of years into a city where the air was thick with the scent of olive oil and burning incense, and the streets hummed with the voices of merchants, shepherds, and travelers from faraway lands. At the heart of this city stood a palace of smooth limestone and towering cedar beams, home to a man whose name had already become legend, King Solomon. His wisdom was sought by rulers, feared by rivals, and trusted by his people. But on this day, even the wisest king would face a decision that would test the limits of human understanding. It began with a quiet murmur in the palace courtyard. Two women arriving together, each clutching their robes tightly, their faces drawn with worry. The guards led them through the grand hall, past pillars carved with lions and pomegranates, until they stood before the throne. At Solomon's side, scribes dipped their pens in ink, ready to record another judgment for the ages. Yet no one in the room could guess that what was about to happen would become one of the most famous moments in all of history. One woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "My lord, this child is mine. I gave him life. I have fed him, cared for him, and loved him from the moment he first breathed. But this woman," she turned sharply to her companion, "took him from my bed while I slept." The second woman shook her head in disbelief. "No, my king, that is not true. She is the one who lost her child, and now she seeks to steal mine." The room fell silent. Every gaze turned to Solomon. In the marketplace outside, people bargained over spices and cloth, unaware that inside these walls, the fate of a single child and the truth hung in the balance. There were no witnesses, no proof, only two desperate voices and one silent infant, too young to speak for himself. Solomon leaned forward, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of his throne. His eyes moved between the women, searching their faces as if reading lines no one else could see. Then, to the astonishment of all present, he said calmly, "Bring me a sword." The word struck the court like a sudden clap of thunder. The guards hesitated, glancing at one another. A sword? For a matter like this? But Solomon's gaze was steady, his voice unshaken. "Bring me a sword and place the child before me." The women froze. The first's eyes widened in horror. The second's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. The crowd held its breath as the sound of boots echoed in the chamber, drawing closer, and with them the glint of a blade under the flickering torchlight. What could the king be planning? And how could such a dangerous order reveal the truth? The answer would be unlike anything they, or we, could imagine. The guard stepped forward, the polished bronze of his armor catching the light as he placed the sword in front of the throne. Its blade was sharp, gleaming, and seemed to hum with the weight of the moment. All eyes were on King Solomon. Some in the court shifted uneasily, others whispered to one another, but none dared to speak aloud the question on everyone's mind. Why would the wisest king in all of Israel call for a weapon when faced with a matter of justice and truth? Outside the palace walls, life continued as usual. Camels carried baskets of dates and figs to the market. Children chased each other down the narrow streets, and the warm desert wind carried the smell of baking bread. But within the palace, time felt frozen. The two women stood still, the child now lying quietly in the nurse's arms. He could not understand the words, but somehow the tension in the air seemed to reach even him, and his tiny fingers curled tightly around the edge of the blanket. Solomon's court was known for its fairness. People traveled from distant lands, Egypt, Tyre, Sheba, to hear the king's judgments. They brought stories of his wisdom back to their own cities, telling of how he could unravel the most tangled disputes with just a few words. Some called it divine insight, a gift from God himself. But today's case was different. There were no contracts to examine, no witnesses to question, no possessions to weigh. Only two mothers, both certain, both desperate, both unwilling to surrender. The first woman's eyes were fixed on the sword. Her breathing quickened, but she said nothing. The second woman shifted her weight, her gaze darting between the king and the guard who now stood ready. The courtiers tried to read Solomon's face, searching for the wisdom they all believed in, but his expression gave nothing away. Somewhere deep in the hall, the soft crackle of the torches was the only sound. The crowd seemed to draw in on itself, as though the whole room was holding a single breath. Solomon reached out and touched the hilt of the sword, his fingers light against the cold metal. He spoke with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning, but now there was an edge to his words, a tone that made the air feel heavier. The tension was almost unbearable. No one knew what was about to happen, but everyone could feel that the king's next words would change everything. What kind of judgment could involve a sword and still reveal the truth? What wisdom could turn such danger into justice? The answer was coming, but no one yet dared to imagine how. The guard's hand tightened on the sword's hilt, waiting for the king's command. Around the throne, the faces of the onlookers reflected a mixture of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. The merchants who had come to petition for trade rights forgot their own business. Even the royal musicians, who often played softly in the background of the court, had fallen silent, their instruments resting in their laps. In the front row stood Eliab, one of Solomon's senior advisors. He had seen the king deliver hundreds of judgments, yet something about this moment unsettled him. This was not the usual measured questioning or careful weighing of evidence. Solomon was moving toward a decision that seemed, on the surface, impossible to understand. Eliab wondered if perhaps there was a hidden layer, some deeper truth the king was drawing out. From the far side of the hall, an older woman in the crowd shook her head. She remembered hearing of Solomon's dream at Gibeon, where God had offered him anything: wealth, long life, victory over enemies, and the young king had asked only for wisdom to rule his people. That wisdom had become his greatest treasure. But would it be enough to solve this? The two women at the heart of the dispute stood rigid. The first glanced at the baby again, her jaw set, as if bracing for something terrible. The second bit her lips so hard it turned white. Neither looked at the other. It was as though the air between them had turned to stone. Then Solomon rose slightly from his throne, and the room seemed to contract around him. No one could guess his exact thoughts, but every heart in the hall knew that the next moment would reveal more than just the truth of the child. It would reveal the heart of the king himself. The king's eyes swept across the hall, pausing on each of the women as though searching for something beyond their words. The sword lay between them, gleaming under the torchlight, its edge catching every flicker of flame. The silence had grown so deep that even the faint shuffle of a servant's foot echoed like a drumbeat. Solomon lifted his hand toward the guard. "Stand ready," he said, his voice steady and clear. The words sent a ripple through the crowd. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of robes. The baby whimpered softly, sensing the unease that gripped the room. The nurse shifted her arms, holding the child a little closer, her eyes darting to the king for reassurance that never came. The first woman's gaze locked on the sword. Her breathing grew quicker, but her chin stayed high, as if determined not to show fear. The second woman's hands trembled against her robe. Her eyes glistened in the flickering light, and she seemed caught between stepping forward and staying rooted in place. Outside, the late afternoon sun began to fade, sending long shadows creeping across the palace floor. The changing light only deepened the gravity of the moment. Courtiers leaned forward, their faces tense. Advisors exchanged quick, uneasy glances. No one dared interrupt. Solomon's expression remained unreadable. He gave no hint of hesitation, no sign of what he truly intended. "Place the child before me," he said at last. The guard obeyed, stepping carefully as if even his footsteps might tip the balance of fate. The baby was set down, the torchlight glinting on the sword that lay ready. Every breath in the hall felt held, every heart braced for the king's next words. Whatever happened now would decide everything. The baby lay between them, wrapped in a simple linen cloth, unaware of the storm swirling overhead. The torchlight danced across the polished floor, casting shadows that made the great hall feel like a place suspended between earth and heaven. Then, just as the guard took his final position, a sudden voice rose from the back of the chamber. "My lord, if I may speak," the voice called out. It belonged to a man dressed in a merchant's robe, his face lined with dust from the road. He bowed low, but his eyes carried urgency. "I know these women. They came from the same house in the lower quarter. There is more to this matter than has been told." The court erupted in murmurs. Solomon's gaze turned toward the man. "Speak, and speak truth," the king commanded. The merchant stepped forward, glancing at both women before continuing. "There was a third child in that house, a baby born to another woman who died shortly after childbirth. The night she passed, the two who stand before you began their quarrel. Each claimed the surviving child was hers. But I tell you, there are whispers in the market that one of them seeks this child not from love, but from the hope of claiming his inheritance." The words struck like a stone dropped into deep water. The courtiers exchanged startled looks. An inheritance meant land, wealth, and the favor of the royal court. This was no longer only a question of a mother's bond. It could be a matter of greed. The first woman's face flushed. "Lies!" she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut. "I want nothing but my son." The second woman's eyes narrowed, her expression shifting, though whether from guilt or outrage was impossible to tell. Solomon did not move. His hand rested lightly on the arm of his throne, but there was a subtle shift in his gaze, as though this new piece of information had deepened the puzzle rather than solved it. The hall fell silent again, but the silence was different now, heavier, charged with new suspicion. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the call of a shofar echoed faintly, signaling the day's end. But inside, time still felt suspended. The baby stirred, a soft cry breaking the stillness, and the sound seemed to press upon everyone in the room. All waited for Solomon's next move, knowing that the truth, whatever it was, would cut deeper than any sword. The hall felt smaller now, the tension pressing in on every wall. Solomon rose fully from his throne, the folds of his royal robe catching the dim light. His voice was calm, but it carried to the farthest corner of the chamber. "Guard," he said, "raise the sword." The steel caught the flicker of the torches as the guard lifted it high. The gasps from the crowd were sharp, like the intake of a single collective breath. Solomon's gaze swept over the two women. "We will divide the child in two," he said, his tone as steady as stone. "Each of you shall have half." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud about to break. The first woman's eyes widened, but her mouth stayed shut. The second woman stepped forward quickly, her voice breaking as she cried out, "No, my lord! Give her the child! Do not harm him! Let him live, even if I never see him again!" Her tears fell freely, glistening on her cheeks. A murmur rippled through the court, but Solomon raised his hand, silencing them. He looked at the guard. "Put down the sword. Give the child to this woman," he said, nodding toward the one who had pleaded for the baby's life. "She is his true mother." Relief swept the hall, and a cheer rose from some of the courtiers. The truth had been revealed not by evidence, but by the deepest bond of a mother's heart. The woman clutched her child, sobbing into his tiny shoulder. The other woman's face hardened, though whether from shame or disappointment, no one could say. But before the court could settle back into its usual rhythm, Solomon's eyes shifted to the merchant who had spoken earlier. "And as for the matter of inheritance," the king said, I have heard enough to know that greed walks quietly among us. The property of the child's late relative will be held in trust until he comes of age, and no one in this hall shall touch it." The merchant's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment a shadow of unease crossed his face. It was then that Solomon's voice cut through once more, quieter now, but sharp as the sword itself. "And when that day comes," he said, "we shall see who still stands in truth." The court fell silent again, not in fear this time, but in awe, knowing they had witnessed the kind of wisdom that would be told for generations. The tension in the great hall slowly began to lift, like clouds breaking after a long storm. The mother who had proven her love held her child close, rocking him gently as if to make up for every moment of fear. The court looked on, some with smiles, others with quiet respect, all aware they had seen more than just a judgment. They had seen King Solomon's wisdom in its purest form. The other woman stepped back without a word. Her eyes no longer met the king's, and her hands hung loosely at her sides. She left the hall with slow, measured steps, her figure fading into the crowd until she was gone. No one followed her. The matter was settled, yet it left behind a quiet lesson about truth, love, and the power of the human heart. Solomon returned to his throne, his expression calm but thoughtful. The merchant who had spoken earlier bowed deeply, perhaps more aware now that the king's wisdom reached beyond simple disputes. Even he seemed humbled, as though reminded that no secret motive could hide for long under the watch of a ruler who valued justice above gain. Outside, the city's life resumed. Traders called out their prices in the market. Children ran through the narrow streets, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. In every corner of Jerusalem the story began to spread, of the two women, the child, and the sword that never struck. People repeated the tale not only for its drama, but for what it revealed, that true wisdom is not in the sharpness of a blade, but in the understanding of hearts. In the days that followed, travelers came from distant lands to hear of this judgment. They spoke of how King Solomon's wisdom could uncover truth where lies seemed unbreakable, and how compassion could be the sharpest tool of all. The story crossed deserts, seas, and generations, becoming one of the most remembered moments in biblical history. As the sun set over Jerusalem that evening, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Solomon looked out from the palace balcony. The city below seemed peaceful, unaware that its fate rested in the mind and heart of one man. Perhaps he knew even then that wisdom was not a treasure to be kept, but a gift to be used, always for the good of the people, and always in the light of truth.